Last time we spoke about the Long March. Amidst escalating conflicts, the Red Army, led by the newly empowered Mao Zedong, faced immense pressures from the Nationalist Army. Struggling through defeats and dwindling forces, they devised a bold retreat known as the Long March. Starting in October of 1934, they evaded encirclement and crossed treacherous terrain, enduring heavy losses. Despite dire circumstances, their resilience allowed them to regroup, learn from their missteps, and ultimately strengthen their strategy, securing Mao Zedong's leadership and setting the stage for future successes against the KMT. During the Long March, the Red Army skillfully maneuvered through treacherous terrain, evading the pursuing National Revolutionary Army. Despite harsh conditions and dwindling numbers, advances and strategic ploys allowed them to cross critical rivers and unite with reinforcements. Under Mao Zedong's leadership, they faced internal struggles but ultimately preserved their unity. By the journey's end, they had transformed into a formidable force, setting the stage for future victories against their adversaries and solidifying their influence in China. This episode is the complicated story about Xinjiang. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so we'll give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I released a rather silly episode covering how to play Japan in the board game Axis and Allies. A lot of cringy memes. Over on Echoes of War, we just released a 3-part series covering the Second Punic War, and a 2-part series covering the Dutch-Japanese Naval War during World War II. Now, if you'd like to support me further, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast with about 26 plus episodes and ongoing, the last episode being Who Financed World War I? You also get early access to all of the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And hey, it is Christmas time. You can gift a Patreon account over to some friends who might like history. And for those of you who are the quickest to do so, please email me. You can find my email address over my YouTube channel. Any critique, criticisms, and what you want to hear more from this podcast and any other project I'm part of. The first ones will be getting a free Patreon account for Christmas. I've probably said this way too many times at this point, but there's one last major series of events I'd like to cover before we jump into the beginning of the 15-year war between China and Japan. When I say Xinjiang, I imagine there are two responses from you in the audience. Number one, what the hell is Xinjiang? And number two, oh yes, that place in northwest China. That pretty much sums it up. The history of this province, or region if you want to call it, is almost never spoken about in the Western world, that is. It was a place, as we have seen multiple times in this series, where conflicts came and went like the weather. But in the 1930s, things really heated up. What I want to talk about is collectively part of the Xinjiang Wars, but more specifically, I want to talk about the Camille Rebellion. There's really no way to jump into this one, so I'm going to have to explain a little bit of the history of Xinjiang first. Xinjiang, in a political sense, is part of China and has been the cornerstone of China's strength and prestige going back to the Han Dynasty over 2,000 years ago. In a cultural sense, however, Xinjiang is more in line with the Muslim-dominated Middle East. It's closer to the Turkic and Iranian-speaking peoples of Central Asia. From a geographical point of view, Xinjiang is very much on the periphery. It is very isolated from Western Asia by the massed ranks of Hindu Kush, the Pamirs, the Tian Shan, the Indian subcontinent of Karakoram, Kunlun, and the Himalaya ranges, and of course, the Gobi Desert. It neither belongs to the east or west. As a province of China, it is the largest and most sparsely populated. It can be divided into two main regions, the Tarim Basin and Sungaria, and then into two lesser but economically significant regions, the Ili Valley, and Turgan Depression. The Xin Chang mountain range extends roughly eastwards from the Pamir Massif, creating a formidable barrier between Sungaria and Tarim Basin. This natural obstacle complicates direct communication between the two regions, particularly during the winter. The Ili Valley, separated by Zengxin by the northern extension of the Tian Shan, is physically isolated from the rest of the province and can only be easily accessed from the west. This western area came under Russian control in the mid-19th century and now forms part of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, it has to be acknowledged, since the formation of the PRC in 1949, Xinjiang changed in size and ethnic composition. The CCP drove a massive Han migrant wave over. Regardless, Hans make up a minority, and according to some population statistics during the 1940s, Xinjiang was dominated by 7 Muslim nationalities, roughly 3.5 million people out of a total population of 3.7 million. 200,000 of these were Han settlers, while 75,000 to about 100,000 were Mongols, Russians, Tungusic peoples, those being Sibo, Solana, Manchu, a few Tibetans, Afghanis, and Indians. Amongst the various indigenous Muslim nationalities of Xinjiang, the Uyghurs stand out as the most numerous and politically important. This Turkic-speaking group primarily consists of sedentary agriculturalists who reside in the oasis of the Tarim Basin, Turfan, Kamul, and the fertile lowlands of the He Valley. In the late 1940s, the Uyghur population of Xinjiang was estimated to be approximately 2.9 million. Following the Uyghurs, the second largest Muslim nationality in the region is the Kazakhs, with an estimated population of around 319,000 during the late Republican period. Kyrgyz come in third, with an estimated population of about 65,000 at the same time. Both the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz in Xinjiang are nomadic Turkic-speaking peoples, with the Kazakhs primarily found in the highland areas of Zengxin and the He Valley, while the Kyrgyz inhabit the upland pastures of Tian Shan and the Pamirs. There also exists a small group of Iranian-speaking mountain Tajiks living in the upland Sarakal region in the far southwest parts, with an estimated population of just 9,000 in the mid-1940s. A primarily urban group of Uzbeks residing in larger oasis towns and cities of Tarim Basin, numbering approximately 8,000 also in the mid-1940s, and a smaller group of Tatars settled mainly in Urumqi and the townships near the Xinjiang Soviet border, estimated to be about 5,000 during the same period. Lastly, it is important to mention the Hui Muslims. These, of course, are a group of Chinese-speaking Muslims dispersed throughout China, particularly in Sungaria and Kamul within Xinjiang, as well as the neighboring northwestern portions of Gansu, Qinghai, and Ningxia. Known as the Tungan, in Xinjiang, the Hui population was estimated to be around 92,000 in the mid-1940s, and they held significant political and military influence during the Republican period. Excluding the Ismaili Tajiks of Sarakol, the Muslim population of Xinjiang, whether Turkic or Chinese-speaking, are Sunni, following the orthodox of Hanafi madhab. As for the non-Muslim population, excluding the Mongols who numbered roughly 63,000 and inhabit a narrow strip of land along the northeastern frontier between Xinjiang and the Mongol People's Republic, Tian Shan, Ili Valley, and Chugychak, most were newcomer migrants from the mid-18th century, while the region was being conquered. Again, according to the same statistics from the 1940s I keep mentioning, Hans represent about 3 to 4% of the population. Although the Han population disproportionately held power with the main administrative areas, they had no sizable territorial enclaves. The Han population can basically be divided into 5 groups: descendants of exiled criminals and political offenders, Hunanese settlers who came over after Zhou Zongtang's conquests, Tianxin merchants who were supplying Zhou Zongtang's army, Shanxi caravaneers who came to trade, and Gansu colonists. Lastly, there were the Tungusic peoples and the Russians. The Tungusic-speaking Sibo, Solana, Manchu settled mostly in the Ilu region. The Russians also tended to live in the Ilu region. These were mostly white Russian refugees from the Civil War. Xinjiang's first Republican governor was Zengxin, a Yunanese native. He had previously worked as the district magistrate in Gansu and Ningxia, earning a reputation as a good manager of the local Tungan Muslim population. In 1908, he was transferred to Xinjiang and quickly found himself promoted to be the last Qing governor of Xinjiang. He held out his post after the Xinhai Revolution and quelled the Urumqi Rebellion soon after. Zengxin survived politically by always siding with whichever faction he thought was winning. For example, in 1917, President Li Yuanhong dispatched Fan Yaoan to watch over Yang and to try and replace him if possible. Yang recognized quickly whichever warlord faction held power over the Beiyang government should be courted. Thus, Yang held out for a long time, and his province was comparably peaceful compared to most of warlord-era China. To maintain his power, Yang enacted a divide-and-rule style, trying to placate the conflicts between certain groups within Xinjiang, but made sure to exclude Russian influence. Basically, Yang tried his best to keep groups who would come into conflict away from each other, keeping the Uyghurs of southern Xinjiang away from the pastoral nomads of Zengxin and Tianshan. Above all, Yang considered the Bolshevik Russians to be the greatest threat to his regime, and in his words, "The Russians aimed at isolating the country from all outside influence, and at maintaining it in a state of medieval stagnation, thus removing any possibility of conscious and organized national resistance. As their religious and education policy, the Russian administrators sought to preserve the archaic form of Islam and Islamic culture. Quranic schools of most conservative type were favored and protected against any modernist influence." Now, during his 16 years of power, Yang established himself as a competent autocrat, a mandarin of the old school, and quite the capable administrator. Yet his economic policies were long-term exploitative, causing hardship and exhausting the province. Yang realized he was reaching the threshold of what the population was willing to endure, and he endeavored to allow corruption to emerge within his administration, provided it remained within acceptable limits, i.e., he did not want to spring forward a Muslim revolution. He opened junior positions in the administration to Muslims, which had a dual effect. It made the Muslim community feel like they were part of greater things, but placed said officials in the path of the population's anger, insulating senior Han officials. Ironically, it would be his fellow Han Chinese officials who would become the angriest with him. Some were simply ambitious of his power, others felt that Xinjiang should be more closely in line with China proper. Rumors have it that at a dinner party, Yang deliberately surrounded himself with opium addicts, stating to his subordinates, "The inveterate opium smoker thinks more of his own comfort and convenience than of stirring up unrest amongst his subordinates." Needless to say, Yang later in the years saw himself seriously alienating senior officials. By 1926, he claimed to have created an earthly paradise in a remote region. So it seems he was quite full of himself. That same year, he turned against his Tongan subordinates. He accused many of conspiring with Ma Qi, a Tongan warlord of Shening and Qinghai, whom he also thought were driven by Urumqi. Deprived of his formerly loyal Tongans, Yang found himself increasingly isolated. An expedition was sent to Urumqi in 1926, where one G.N. Royrich noted, "The governor's residence consisted of several well-isolated buildings and enclosed courtyards. The gates were carefully guarded by patrols of heavily armed men. The governor's yamen seemed to us to have been very dilapidated in condition. The glass in many of the windows on the ground floor were broken, and dirty papers and rags had been pasted on the window frames. Numerous retainers roamed about the courtyards, and villainous bodyguards armed with Mauser pistols were on duty at the entrance to the yamen." It seems likely Yang had decided to leave Xinjiang at some point. He had amassed an immense personal fortune and sent much of it to his family in China proper, and also to Manila, where he had a secret bank account. Further evidence of this was provided by Mildred Cable and Francesca French, two members of the China Inland Mission, who reported, "Wise old Governor Yang, as early as in 1926, quietly arranged a way of escape for his family and for his transference of his wealth to the security of the British concession in Tianjin. Later in that same year, accompanied by several luggage cases of valuables, Yang's eldest son was sent out of Xinjiang, traveling incognito, in the company of these missionaries." It was also at this time Yang erected a statue of himself in the public gardens of Urumqi. According to Nicholas Roerich, this memorial was paid for with forced contributions from, quote, "the grateful population." But by all accounts, the statue was a really bad move. While the NRA was marching up Beijing in June of 1928, Yang ordered the KMT flag to be raised in Xinjiang. This gesture indicated to all Yang was about to depart the province. But one of Yang's most dissident subordinates, a Han named Fan Yaoan, decided to act. Fan Yaoan was an ambitious modernist who received his education in Japan, and someone Yang really distrusted from day one. Fan was appointed the post of Taoyin of Aksu by the Beijing government, an appointment Yang could have easily ignored. But he soon begrudgingly became impressed by Fan's abilities. Fan proved himself very useful to Yang, and he was soon promoted to the Taoyin of Urumqi, alongside becoming the Xinjiang provincial commissioner for foreign affairs. It seems Fan and Yang mutually disliked each other. At some point in 1926, Fan got together with a small group of like-minded officials, such as an engineer at Urumqi's telegraph station and the dean of the local school of law, and Fan told them he simply wanted to assassinate Yang. Some believe Fan sought to gain favor with the KMT as motivation. Regardless, on July the 7th of 1928, 6 days after Yang took the post of chairman of the Xinjiang provincial government under the KMT, Fan attacked. On that day, Yang was invited to a banquet. And yes, it always seems to be a goddamn banquet in this part of China. How many times are these guys going to fall for the same trick, you know? Anyways, he was invited to a banquet to celebrate a graduation ceremony at Urumqi Law School. Fan had arranged the banquet with 18 soldiers present, disguised as waiters, wearing red bands around their arms and brown pistols in their sleeves. During the meal, Fan proposed to toast to the health of Yang, at which time, quote, "Shots rang out simultaneously, all aimed at the governor. 7 bullets all were fired, and all reached their mark. Yang, mortally wounded, but superb in death, glared an angry defiance at his foes and said, 'Who dares do this?' He questioned in a loud voice which had commanded instant obedience for so many years. Then he fell slowly forward, his last glance resting upon the face of the trusted Yen, as though to ask forgiveness that he had not listened to the advice so often given to him." Accordingly to Yang Tingshan, who was also wounded, Fan Yaoan finished Yang Zengxin off with 2 shots personally. After the assassination, whereupon 16 people were killed or wounded, Fan went to Yang's official residence and seized the seals of office. He then sent a letter summoning Jin Shujin, the commissioner for civil affairs in Xinjiang, and Yang's second-in-command. Jin Shujin called Fan's bluff and refused to come, instead sending soldiers to arrest the assassin. It seems Fan greatly miscalculated his personal support, as a short gun battle broke out, and he was arrested by Jin, and shortly thereafter he was executed with his conspirators on July the 8th. And thus, Jin Shujin found himself succeeding Yang, a less able man to do the job. Jin Shujin was a Han Chinese from Gansu. He graduated from the Gansu Provincial Academy, and he served for a time as the principal of the provincial normal school. He then entered the Imperial Civil Service, where he came to the attention of Yang, then at that time working as a district magistrate at Huzhou. Yang took him on as a district magistrate, and Jin rose through the ranks. In 1927, Jin became the provincial commissioner of civil affairs at Urumqi. After executing Fan, Jin sent a telegram to Nanjing seeking the KMT's official recognition of his new role. Nanjing had no real options. To be honest, they really didn't care about the region. It was a fait accompli. So they confirmed Jin into office, and under the new KMT terminology, he was appointed provincial chairman and the commander-in-chief. For lack of better words, he was made a warlord. Following his seizure of power, Jin immediately took steps to secure his newfound power. His first step was to double the salaries of the secret police and army. He also expanded the military and acquired new weaponry for them. Politically, Jin maintained the same old Qing policies of Yang, pretty much unchanged. Jin did, however, replace many of the Yunnanese followers under Yang with Han Chinese from Gansu. Jin's younger brother, Jin Shujin, was appointed the provincial commissioner for military affairs at Urumqi, and his older brother, Jin Shujin, was given the senior military post at Kashgar. His personal bodyguard member, Zhu Qiaoqi, was promoted brigade commander at Urumqi. Jin maintained and expanded upon Yang's system of internal surveillance and censorship, like any good dictator would. According to French Ridley of the China Inland Mission at Urumqi, people were executed for merely making indiscreet remarks in the street during ordinary conversation. Jin also introduced a system of internal passports so that any journey performed within Xinjiang required an official passport validation by the provincial chairman's personal seal, tightening his security grip and, of course, increasing his official revenue. Travel outside Xinjiang became nearly impossible, especially for Han officials and merchants seeking to trade with China proper. Under Jin Shujin, Xinjiang's economy deteriorated while his fortune accumulated. Yang had introduced an unbacked paper currency that obviously fell victim to inflation, and Jin upped the ante. Within a process of several stages, he expanded the currency, causing further inflation. Under Yang, the land taxes had been a serious source of provincial revenue, but Yang was not foolish enough to squeeze the Turkic peasantry too hard. He certainly was intelligent enough to thwart peasant revolts. Jin, however, not so smart. He tossed caution to the wind, and he doubled the land taxes, way past what was considered the legal amount. Jin also emulated Ma Fuxiang by establishing government monopolies over various profitable enterprises, notably the gold mine at Kiria and the jade mine at Khotan. He also monopolized the wool and pelt industry, using his police and army to force the sale of lambskins at a mere 10% of their market value. Just as with Yang's regime, wealth flowed out of the province in a continuous stream, straight into the banks within China proper. According to George Vassel, a German engineer and a Nazi agent hired to construct airfields in Gansu during the 1930s, he knew a German pilot named Rife, who was secretly employed by Jin to fly millions of dollars worth of gold bullion from Urumqi to Beijing. Jin did his best to keep all foreign influence out of Xinjiang, and this extended also to the KMT officials from China proper. Jin also, of course, did his best to conceal his corrupt regime from Nanjing. For all intents and purposes, Jin treated Xinjiang like a feudal medieval society. He tried to limit external trade to only be through long-distance caravans. All was fine and dandy until Feng Yuxiang occupied Gansu and then disrupted the traditional trade routes. Alongside this, the Soviets had just constructed a new railroad linking Frunze, the capital of Kyrgyz, with the Semipalatinsk in western Siberia. This railroad, known as the Turksib, was aimed primarily to develop western Turkestan, integrating it within the new Soviet system. The railroad was constructed 400 miles away from the Xinjiang frontier, on purpose to limit any activities with the capitalists. When the railroad was completed in 1930, it virtually strangled Xinjiang. China's share of Xinjiang's market dropped by 13%, and the value of trade with the Soviets, which had dropped to practically zero since the Russian Civil War, was now rising past 32 million rubles by 1930. The Soviet trade gradually was seizing a monopoly over Xinjiang, and this of course affected the merchants and workers who were unable to compete. The revenue of the merchants and workers declined as new taxes were levied against them. Meanwhile, alongside an increase in Soviet trade, the new railway also increased Soviet political influence over Xinjiang. It was also much faster and easier to travel from China proper to Xinjiang via Vladivostok, the Trans-Siberian Railway, and the Turksib, then across the northwest roads to China. For the Turkic-speaking Muslims of Xinjiang, it was quite impressive, and many wanted to do business and mingle with the Soviets. However, to do so required a visa, and thus KMT officials in Nanjing held the keys to that. Jin's policies towards the Turkic Muslims, Tongans, and Mongols were extremely poor from the very beginning. It seems Jin held prejudice against Muslims, some citing bad experiences with them in Gansu. Whatever the case may be, Jin rapidly antagonized both his Turkic-speaking and Tongan Muslim citizens by introducing a tax on the butchering of all animals in Xinjiang and forbidding Muslims to perform the Hajj to Mecca. Some point out that he did that second part to thwart a loophole on leaving Xinjiang for trade. Obviously, the Muslim majority of Xinjiang and the military powerhouse of the Turgut Mongols in the Tin Shan bitterly resented Jin. Despite wide-scale hostility against him, the first challenges at his autocratic rule came not from various minority groups, but some ambitious Han officers under his command. Palpatine would say it was rather ironic. In May of 1929, the Taoyin of Altai attempted a coup against Jin, but he was forewarned and able to confine the fighting to the Shara-Sume area. In the spring of 1931, troubles broke out in Urumqi as discontented Han officers and soldiers attacked Jin's Yamen. The attack failed, and the instigators of the plot were all executed. That same year, Jin annexed the Kumul Khanate, known to the Chinese as Hami, finally pushing the Turkic-speaking Muslims into a full-blown open rebellion. But going back in time, after Zhou Zongtang's reconquest of Xinjiang in the 1870s, a few local principalities were permitted to survive on a semi-autonomous basis. Of these, Kamul was the most important and was ruled by a royal family dating back to the Ming dynasty and descended from the Chagatai Khans. The Khanate of Kamul dominated the chief road from Xinjiang to China proper and was therefore a strategic importance to the Chinese. It extended from Yiwanchuan northwards to Barkul Tag and along the mountains to Bai and south of Xinxia, along the Xinjiang-Gansu border. During the Shanghai Revolution of 1911, Maksud Shah was sitting on the throne of Kamul. He was known to the Chinese as Hami Wang, to his subjects as Khan Maksud or Sultan Maksud, and to the Europeans as the King of the Gobi Desert. He was the last independent Khan of Central Asia, as the rest were now tossing their lot in with progress of the times. During Yang's regime, he was content with allowing Kamul to train its semi-autonomous status, mostly because Maksud Shah was very friendly towards the Chinese. He spoke Turkic with a marked Chinese accent, and he wore Chinese clothes. On the other hand, he had a long white beard and always wore a turban or a Uyghur cap. He was a staunch Muslim, ruling a petty oasis kingdom from an ancient and ramshackle palace in Kamul proper, one of the 3 towns making up the capital of Kamul, known to the Chinese as Huichang. He had a bodyguard consisting of 40 Chinese soldiers armed with Mausers, and had a Chinese garrison in a fortified Chinese town. The 3rd city of his domain was known as New City or Xinjiang, populated by a mix of Chinese and Turkic peoples. By 1928, shortly after the assassination of Yang, it was estimated Maksud Shah ruled over roughly 25 to 30,000 Kamuliks. He was responsible for levying taxes, dispensing justice, and so forth. His administration rested upon 21 begs, 4 of whom were responsible for Kamul itself, 5 others over the plains villages, and another 12 over mountain regions of Barkul and Tarlik Tak. Maksud Shah also maintained a Uyghur militia who had a reputation as being better trained than its Chinese counterpart at the Old City. Throughout Yang's regime, Kamul remained relatively peaceful and prosperous. Maksud Shah paid a small annual tribute to Ramchi, and in return, the Xinjiang government paid him a formal subsidy of 1,200 silver taels a year. Basically, this was Yang paying for the Sultan's compliance when it came to moving through his strategic Khanate. For the Uyghurs of Kamul, they were free from typical persecution under Chinese officials. The only tax paid by the citizens of Kamul was in livestock, generally sheep or goats, given annually to the Khan. The soil of the oasis was rich and well cultivated. Everything was pretty fine and dandy under Yang, but now was the time of Jin. In March of 1930, Maksud Shah died of old age. His eldest son, Nasir, should have inherited the throne of Kamul, but Jin and his Han subordinates stationed in Kamul City had other plans. Shortly after Maksud Shah's death, Nasir traveled to Urumqi, most likely to legitimize his rise up to the throne. Nasir was not very popular amongst his people, thus it seemed he needed Jin's aid to bolster him. However, there also was the story that it was Jin who ordered Nasir to come to Urumqi to perform a formal submission. Now at the time of Maksud Shah's death, Li Xizeng, a Han Chinese divisional commander stationed in Kamul, suggested to Jin that the Khanate should be abolished and annexed officially. There was, of course, a great rationale for this. If Jin took control over Kamul, it would offer increased revenue and new positions for his Han Chinese officials. Thus, Jin ordered a resolution to be drawn up by his ministers to abolish the Khanate, dividing Kamul into 3 separate administrative districts, Hami centered around the capital, Iho, and Iwu. When Nasir arrived in Urumqi, he was given the new position of senior advisor to the provincial government, but forbidden to return to Kamul. Basically, it was the age-old government via hostage-taking. Meanwhile, another official named Yulbaz was sent back to Kamul with a group of Chinese officials to set up a new administration. Now, while the people of Kamul had no love for Nasir, they were taxed pretty heavily by his father, after all, this did not mean that they wanted the Khanate to end. For the Turkic Muslims, the Khanate held a religious significance. For the Uyghurs, there was a question of national pride associated with it. Of course, there were also economic issues. Within Xinjiang, Han were allowed to settle, but in the Khanate there were restrictions. In the words of the Nanjing official Wu Aqian on the situation, Subject peoples obstinately prefer self-government to good government. Well, Jin's government was certainly not good. So what outcome does that give? The newly appointed Han administration upset the people of Khmer from the very minute of its installation. When it was announced the privilege of being exempt from direct taxation by Urumqi was abolished, well, oomph. To add insult to injury, 1 year of taxes were to be collected from the Uyghur. On top of that, Khmer was tossed wide open to Han settlers who were incentivized to settle by giving them tax exemptions for over 2 years. So yeah, that'd be some wild policies if you think about it. To add even more misery, Khmer, being situated on the chief road from northwestern Gansu to Xinjiang, saw an enormous flow of refugees from famine and warfare going on in Gansu. A column of these refugees were seen by one Birger Baulin. He was part of the Sino-Swedish expedition of 1931. In his account, he states, "During my stay at Haihatsu, I witnessed a curious spectacle. The Chanfan region had a number of years been visited by failure of crops and famine. A large number of people therefore emigrated to a more prosperous track. Such an emigration wave now passed Haihatsu. It consisted of a caravan of 100 camels transporting 150 persons with all of their baggage to Xinjiang, where it was said that the land was being thrown wide open. It seemed to Baolin that the refugees looked carefree and happy, and that the ruler of Xinjiang, Jin Shujin, a Gansu man himself, was enthusiastic to have them come settle in his province. Jin had his official in charge of Aiho district, Long Shulin, provide land for the would-be settlers coming from Gansu. Long Shulin responded by forcing his Uyghur population to leave their cultivated land and simply hand it over to the refugees. The expropriated Uyghurs were compensated for their land by being given untilled lands on the fringe of the desert, where most of the soil was barren. And on top of that, the Uyghurs were also assessed for their land tax based on their old holdings. And get this, it gets even worse. The untilled land was exempt from taxation for 2 years, so they didn't even get that. While the Gansu refugees were excused from tax payments for over 3 years. So yeah, the Khmer people quickly organized a petition and they sent it to the Yamen in Urumqi. There was zero acknowledgement from the Yamen, no one knows it was even received, and nothing was done to address the long list of grievances, especially from the Uyghurs. Instead, the Gansu settlers kept flooding in, and with them the price of food skyrocketed, largely because of the enormous amount of provincial troops sent in to watch over everybody. Now, for the moment, the Turkic-speaking Muslims in the region remained relatively peaceful, and this perhaps lulled Jin into a false sense of security. But according to Sven Hedin of the Sino-Swedish expedition, discontent increased. The people clenched their teeth and bided their time. The atmosphere was tense and gloomy. Inflammable matter accumulated, and only a spark was needed to fire the powder magazine. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I created a comedic episode on how to play Japan in the board game Axis and Allies. As for Echoes of War, we just completed a 3-part series on the Second Punic War, and a 2-part series on the Dutch-Japanese Naval War during the Pacific War. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Joining either gets you access to the exclusive podcast with over 26+ episodes and ongoing, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The history of Xinjiang is unbelievably bizarre, complicated, and quite frankly, a lot of fun. Before researching this, I had no idea about anything, so in some ways, I'm an audience member as well. The next episode is going to be on the Khmer Rebellion, so buckle up, buckaroo.